Okay.
Should we give a few minutes for people to join before getting started?
Okay, the streaming is set up. As soon as everyone is in, we can go ahead.
Well, welcome everybody. We'll just give it 1 or 2 more minutes to let the stragglers join us before we get going with the AmeriFlux webinar for data users. Okay, welcome everybody to this week's iteration of the AmeriFlux Management Project seminar series, or webinar series, sorry. Today we're going to be talking about AmeriFlux for data users, as you are all aware, I'm sure. Thank you for joining. I'd like to start off by encouraging you to turn on your webcam if you feel disposed to do so. It's always good to put faces to names and see y'all in this isolated world we're currently living in. Great, welcome. Welcome especially to our panelists who are going to be providing their thoughts later. We're very grateful for your presence. So today we're going to talk about AmeriFlux for data users and what AmeriFlux has been doing and what AmeriFlux can do more to help you, the users of data, and hopefully many of you are also data providers, to do better research with AmeriFlux. So the goals of today's webinar are targeted towards people who are using AmeriFlux data and interested in AmeriFlux data products, both those that exist currently, those that we're planning in the near future, and those with your input and guidance we could build to greatly facilitate your science. And we're also targeting this towards data providers who are interested in learning more about how their data is used and also how they can use what AmeriFlux is doing to better use their own data too. So we're going to give a brief overview of AmeriFlux data, of AmeriFlux itself, and then AmeriFlux data. We're going to invite Deb Agarwal to talk about data use policies in AmeriFlux and current changes that are happening to those that are quite exciting. Then Margaret Thorne is going to lead us through some data discovery features that we've developed to help you better discover AmeriFlux data, which is becoming more important over the last few years as AmeriFlux has grown the amount and different types of data that it is hosting. Then Gilberto Pastorello is going to talk us through some developments with OneFlux, which are particularly exciting as well. After that, we're going to have feedback from a data user panel, and then we're going to talk with you all about what you are excited to see from AmeriFlux in terms of data user things that we can offer to improve the data user experience. I'm sure you're all super familiar with Zoom at this stage, but just to remind you to please mute yourself during the presentation. You should feel free to unmute to ask questions in the question and answer session. You can anytime post questions in chat, comments, or highlights in the chat window, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can on those. And also feel free to email support if you're having any issues with the webinar. Before we get into it, I'd just like to get a sense of you. How many of you, we have 77 participants online. So we're going to just do a brief poll of how many of you have actually used data from the AmeriFlux website before. Now, I want to emphasize AmeriFlux here because a lot of people are using the FluxNet data as well, or data from other networks. And so we're really thinking about AmeriFlux data here from the AmeriFlux website. So you should see a little window pop up. If you could provide your input there, that would be much appreciated. While we're getting that input, I'd just also like to draw your attention to a previous webinar that we have had in this series that may have gone over your radar or under the radar, technically speaking. So the post-emission data lifecycle webinar was primarily focused on data providers so they understand the data that they provide, what process it goes through before we publish it as something we call the base product. But this is also super useful for data users to understand how the data they're using is produced and what goes into it. So I'd just like to draw your attention to that so you can go back and look at that if you missed it. Okay, so we have 60% of people attending have downloaded data from the AmeriFlux website before, 40% have not. So this is great. You're going to learn a lot about how to do that. And those of you who have used the data or downloaded from AmeriFlux will also learn a lot more, hopefully. And so about AmeriFlux, before we get into it, what is AmeriFlux? So AmeriFlux is a network of sites that are primarily PI-led and driven sites across the Americas. So it was established in 1996 by a group of scientists and has since expanded from the 15 sites that were in the network then to many, many more. We currently have 390 sites across the Americas. So that's over 2,500 site years of data. So in 2012, the Department of Energy established something called the AmeriFlux Management Project, and that's AMP for short. So that is the team primarily at Berkeley Lab, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab here in Berkeley, who help to organize the network and to surface the data, harmonize the data, and make it as easy to use as possible for the general public. That's our mission. And so in the AmeriFlux Management Project, we develop the web interface you're familiar with, and also have a bunch of different roles through which we support the AmeriFlux network. And I encourage you to go and visit the AmeriFlux website to see all of the different fun things that we do. So before we get into the data itself, I thought it would be important to think about the data use policy, because this is super important. It outlines what you need to do when using the data, right? And how data providers, what their role is in engagement with the data users. So I'd like to invite Deb Agarwal to talk us through this briefly. Deb, are you there?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. So this is a little bit updated from the website, but this is a version of the current AmeriFlux data use policy. So basically, you're expected to cite the data for each of the sites that you used. So there's a data set citation. It's available multiple ways. I think Margaret's going to talk about how you can get that most conveniently through the site set mechanism. But we have several tools to help you do that citation. And you're expected to inform all data providers of that publication, of the analysis you're doing in the publication, and acknowledge the data source. So if we now look at if you could go on, Trevor. So we're also adding a new policy. So it's not that all sites are moving to the new policy, but we're inviting sites to move to this new policy. So the new policy will use CC BY 4 license for the data use. That'll actually open up the data to free use and reuse, which is not different from the prior policy, but now just we provide the proper citation. Sites receive data download notifications still. One of the big things that moving to CC BY 4 it will give the user community is that more publishers will accept that this is a valid repository for the data that you're citing. The publishers more and more are moving to that. They expect the data to be CC BY 4 or CC 0. This will start to move this will move the data towards CC BY 4. We'll also still be supporting sites that don't choose to move to CC BY 4 on the AmeriFlux policy that I showed you. And you know, some of the things that happen on all the data are these checks that people will talk about. We do a lot of quality checks at AMP. We also do a lot of technical services, though for people who remain on the older policy, they won't have quite the same level of service on that. So we're actually hoping that folks will move. And Trevor, if you could go to the next slide, if you have the updated, yeah. So this is the text of the new policy. So it's under CC BY 4. BY 4 means that, so the BY means by attribution. So you're still need to provide attribution. And then basically the attribution text that we provide for how to do that is to provide a citation to each site's data set that you've used, including its DOI. And there's still a note requesting that you contact the individual site PIs, but it's now no longer a requirement. It's a suggestion that you do that. So back to you, Trevor. Oh, and actually, I wanted to also point out we have started inviting sites to choose CC BY 4 as the policy. We'll roll it out in about August of this year, and we've only invited a small number of the sites to try and get this rolling, and we already have 108 sites who've chosen CC BY 4. So that'll already be almost a third of the sites that will definitely be CC BY 4 starting late summer. So and again, I expect that will be a lot more than that because we haven't yet invited all the sites to make that selection. So back to you, Trevor.
Thank you, Deb. So this is super important because it's moving the policy from AmeriFlux that was previously to a new, more open policy. So we're fully in favor of open science and also being a little bit more in line with the recent move of FluxNet to more an open data policy as well. And it's great to see, as Deb said, that we have so many people, site PIs, who are signing up for this and willing to share their data openly under CC BY 4 license. So now that we know the data use policy and what you need to do when you're using the data in terms of giving appropriate credit and following the data use policy correctly, so let's talk about what AmeriFlux data is and what you can use it for. So when you download AmeriFlux data, you have the option of various different files, right? The primary file is what we call base. And so what is base? Base is a file from AmeriFlux, one file per site, that includes all the Flux and Met data from that site. Okay, so it is primarily time series data, Flux Met, and also some concentration data, which is neither a flux or a meteorological variable. So these are the half-hour, hourly time series observations. And observations of what, you might ask? So a lot of different things, it turns out. So primarily, AmeriFlux is focused on carbon fluxes. This is one of the requirements to be an AmeriFlux site. We also have a lot of sites submitting various other observations. What you see on the bottom left are the observations that each site is submitting, distributed by the number of sites submitting each. So the observations are on the x-axis and the number of sites submitting each on the y-axis. And just to make this a little bit more easy to see, we've made this word cloud. And so because these are all acronyms, and I definitely apologize for that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what they are. And So in black, you are the most commonly reported measurements at each site. And I should preface this by saying that sites are not mandated to report particular variables other than carbon, which they need to be doing to be involved in AmeriFlux. So they can measure all or none of these different variables, right? Except for CO2. And that's why some sites we have a lot of some different types of measurements and very few of others. And this is in difference to other networks such as NEON, where the actual measurements are mandated. And this is part of the historic nature of AmeriFlux, where it really is a site PI driven network, and PIs measure what they feel is most important, or what they have funding or bandwidth to measure at a site. So the darker colors here represent those variables that are most commonly measured. And you'll see that most of them are either carbon, so that's the FC, or meteorological variables, such as wind speed, air temperature, relative humidity. LE is the water fluxes, latent energy, also temperature of the soil, and sensible heat, pressure. So these are the variables that you will most commonly find when you download information from AmeriFlux, from this base time series. We also have other measurements, which are also super interesting, but more rarely measured, such as, for example, true fall, or temperature of the canopy, methane fluxes, which are a growing measurement across the network, especially after a year of methane campaigns. And one interesting point to note is that GPP or ECO, so it's gross canopy photosynthesis or net ecosystem respiration, total ecosystem respiration. So these are, as you see here, quite small. They're not reported by a lot of sites. And this is also in difference to FluxNet, where you download the equivalent of base from FluxNet, you'll get GPP, this partitioned data. We don't do that in a standardized way at AmeriFlux. These are partitioned estimates provided by the site PIs from their own individual methods for doing that as they see best fits for their site. But we'll talk later today about how we are developing GPP or ECO and other partitioned and gap-filled products for to be equivalent to those that are produced in the FluxNet dataset. So there are over 130 different variables that are reported by AmeriFlux PIs and that we process in the AmeriFlux management project and surface in the base product for users to make use of. So when you're downloading this data and you approach it, you can think about some of the pros and cons. The pros are that it's a lot of data. And we cover a huge diversity of sites, over 390 sites across a multitude of different ecosystems and environmental types across the Americas. And it really is one of the only direct and continuous observations of ecosystem function. So how ecosystems respond to the environment. So it really is a wealth of information, particularly about carbon, water, energy, and impacts, feedbacks to climate. And some of the cons are that there's a lot of uncertainty. As with any measurements, you have both random and systematic error. So this is something you need to be conscious of when looking at the time series that you download. There are also gaps. Sometimes those gaps can be just an hour, a day, months, depending on what caused the gap. So power goes off. These are natural ecosystems. There's a lot of random things happen out in the wild. Weather becomes inclement, such as in high latitude systems where winter makes it very, very difficult to make any measurements at all. Towers fall over, etc. So just be conscious of the fact that the data you get is full of gaps, and that is normal and expected. And there are also things that are unexplained in the observations. So these are, again, observations made in the wild, and lots of things happen in the wild, such as cats. I don't know if you saw my cat try to enter the screen there. Beavers, for example, they build dams and cause changes in the dynamics of a site that may not be quite as easy to detect or understand what's happening. This is important because it's very important to know what is driving the dynamics of the data that you're using. If you're using data from a large amount of sites, that can be really quite difficult to do, but it's one of the challenges in effectively synthesizing across a large number of sites in the AmeriFlux network. And that is why Badam is so important. So what is Badam? Badam is something that we can use to, as Ray Luning, who famously always said, know thy site. So to get a better understanding of the characteristics of a specific site, we provide a separate data set, separate from base, called Badam. Badam is the biological ancillary data metadata file, and it contains a host of information about various different aspects of the site. So these are typically not continuous time series information. These are information such as disturbance events, characteristics of the site, contact details, or publications for references for the site. Anything that you could imagine that you would need to better contextualize your understanding of the fluxes that are included in base. Now, it is a somewhat unwieldy data to work with. And I say that because it is not really designed to be human readable. You can read it for sure. It all makes sense. But there is a lot of data contained within these sites, as you can imagine. So for example, when you download and open one of these files, this is the Badam file for Harvard and the USHA1 site, you see what I mean. So the lot of codes for various different sources of information and characteristics of that information. The Harvard file is about 7,000 lines long. Okay, so it's not something you can just scroll through and pick out the numbers you want very easily. But it is designed to be very easily machine readable. So as data users, I would strongly encourage you to use a code in whatever your preferred language is to interact with Badam to extract the information you need to contextualize the data that you're using in base. And just one note that these files are actually, when you download them, are not called Badam, they're called BIF for reasons we won't go into. BIF stands for the Badam interchange format. It's basically the rules through which Badam is formatted. So when you download the data and you see a BIF file, just so you know that this is actually the Badam file. I apologize for that. And all of these acronyms as well. But sometimes this is necessary when you've got such a huge diversity of data and different formats to work with. So as we did before, we're going to launch a brief poll right now because we'd like to get a better understanding of those of you who have actually used Badam data. Simple yes, no. Have you used Badam data in the past? We now know how many of you have used AmeriFlux data. So this will help us get a better sense of how many people are using Badam and therefore to what extent we need to improve the usability of Badam. I'll just take a minute to let those numbers come in because I don't want to interrupt the next slides. Looks like we're good. Okay, all but 8 of you have responded, which is great. And we see 70% of people have not used Badam. So clearly we have some work to do to improve the usability of Badam. We are working on that, by the way, just so you know. We have a few different things in the pipeline that we're going to make it much easier to use in the future. It's not an easy challenge, however. Okay, so now that we know what the data is that you can use, how do you discover data? And for this, I'd like to hand over to Margaret Torn and the AMP lead PI to lead us through some features that we've developed for search, download, mapping, and site sets. Thank you, Margaret.
Yeah, thank you, Trevor. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you all here. What I want to do is give you just an invitation to explore the AmeriFlux.lbl.gov website and some features. So it's no time for a tutorial, but I can invite you to look at a few things. And Trevor, I'm going to ask you to click through kind of quickly starting now. So as you heard, you can download data for 390 AmeriFlux sites. So how do you find the sites or the data that you want to use? The first tool I wanted to mention is the site search tool, which I think is fantastic. I use it all the time. So because you're interested in data to download, you first want to select sites with data. That'll produce that table of 390 sites. Now we want to dig in a little deeper. So next slide, I'm going to use the advanced filters tool. So by selecting advanced filters, you get choices of things like geography, vegetation class, disturbance, like maybe you want sites that have experienced fire. So if people have reported that in their Badam, it'll come up there. I want to talk about flux measurements because I thought one nice example would be how many sites and which sites collected methane flux data where I can download it, but the data were collected before 2012. So what are the original methane sites? So I'm using advanced filters, and then I'm using the flux met measurements. And then in that bottom corner, I don't have access to the mouse, but I'm going to look at available base flux met data. Next slide, please. That returns this long table of all the different data, all the different variables that are returned, that are provided or reported in the AmeriFlux base product. So here I've selected flux of methane, that's FCH4. I know it's really little. And the years, I said I want any years in the range 1996 to 2012. You can do that starting from 1992 when the first AmeriFlux site reported data, and you get the same value. Okay, so then I apply my filter, next slide. And now on the site search page, there on the right, now there's just 14 sites. I've got a table of 14 sites, and I can see which ones they are. I can export that, which in an export that'll also give me the PI contact name and address, but I want to do more with it. So next slide, please. What are we going to do with our 14 sites? I want to know, how do I download data for those sites? Can I make a map of those sites? And if there's time, today I'll tell you how to save a site set, and that will help you with getting the DOI to citation for the data policy. Next slide, please. Okay, data download, it's pretty easy. First, sign in. Then you can do more when you sign in. Second, you just click on the button that says download data using search results. Next slide. This is the slide that the next page that you'll see. And it is going to ask you to select sites. I'm getting a little echo. And it'll ask you if you want the Badam, ask you for your intended use, and you download all files. But I'm going to zoom in on the top half. Trevor, next slide, please. Two things I wanted to mention. The first is that right now, Badam don't include the measurement height up or soil depth down, and the exact instrument model information in case you need that. But you can download that information on the measurement height page. Second thing is very cool. We have now 4 ways to select sites for download. In this example, because I came from site search, I've got my 14 sites ready to go from the site search, but I could have copied in a comma delimited list. I could have just picked through all 390 sites, or I can upload a site set. So there's different ways you can do this, but today I'm just coming from site search. Okay, so next slide. I've clicked download. I actually go to the page where I get the data, the manifest, and the Badam files. And so you can look at that and figure out how to do it. If there's a lot of sites, we recommend using a third-party browser tool. So you have to read the instructions. Next slide, please. Another thing that can be really helpful for selecting sites, and of course, visualizing and sharing what you've done, is to make a map of the sites. You can do that right there on the site search page. But I like to go to the customize map tool. So I'm going to toggle from from site search to the customize map. So Trevor, next slide, please. So this page lets you change the base layer. You can do satellite, MODIS, globe cover, and you can change the markers, you can add titles, and you can save the file. So here I've just got the default base layer, default markers, and it shows me those 14 original methane sites. You can even zoom in. So if you look at the Southeast US, US-LA1, let's go there, Trevor, real quickly. So I'm just zooming in to show you that 2 sites that had measured methane flux are right there near New Orleans and Lake Pontchartrain, and that's where the AGU fall meeting will be this year. If anyone is there or you're attending virtually, you can at least picture this satellite image and think that you're there. Trevor, do I have time to show something about site set, or should we wrap this up? And you're muted. or I can't hear. All right, somebody just waved to me, tell me to keep going or not. All right, next slide, please. All right, I mentioned site sets. And again, I know this is fast, but this is an invitation to you to explore our website and web tools. So if you look at the left-hand image here, this is just a cutout from that site search page. And one of the options that I had was to save or load a site set. So I like my 14 original methane sites, and I want to save it and be able to come back to that. So I select from there that I'm going to save a site set. I can also return back to my site sets or go right to the page where I could select them from the home menu, which I'm showing in that right-hand image where it says site sets. And just to let you know, things below the line there, if you log in, you'll see slightly different things, but if you log in, you will see site sets. Next page, please. Or next slide. Great. So I've now saved my site set, and it takes me over here to this nice page on my site sets list. I have quite a few because I do a lot of different things with AmeriFlux. And I've selected the methane to 2012 site set. And what I get on the right is not just a list of the sites, but a nice map. And this little box that says download for set, DOIs as ASCII. Next slide, please. This is one thing, a feature I think is really cool, which is you can download right there for your set of sites that you're using, a handy table that'll have the site ID, the site name, the DOI, and the DOI citation that you can put in the paper when you're citing that site's data. So we really try to make it easy for you to give credit and to make your study reproducible and help you keep track of what you've used. And you can edit that site set and add sites and subtract them. So that is what I had. So thank you. I hope you have a good time exploring the data and the website. Thanks.
Thanks, Margaret. And sorry, my headphone cut out for a second there. Okay, great. That is super useful, hopefully for you all to understand how you can discover AmeriFlux data more readily and more easily. And we are, just to highlight that, yeah, we are running a poll at the end of this webinar. We're going to view your input. In this poll, we would like you to suggest what additional features. So now you've seen all the features that we're going to talk about, and not all of them. So bear that in mind when you're inputting this. I wanted to put this here so you have time to think about what features you'd like to see before we get to the end. In that poll, you can also upvote or downvote other people's suggestions. So please feel free to do that as well. Okay, so let's move along. The link to the poll is in the chat, and it's also pollev.com/AmeriFlux. So just type that into your search bar as well if you want to go directly. So one of those features that you may be thinking of, I'd love gap-filled data with partitioned photosynthesis and respiration estimates. Hold that thought. We're going to invite Gilberto Pastorella now to lead us through what is happening with OneFlux.
Great, thank you, Trevor. Yeah, so basically OneFlux is this collaborative pipeline that we developed in a collaboration with the European team and a few other folks from around the world and other regional networks. And basically this pipeline is what we've been using to generate these data sets that have been gap-filled, filtered for low turbulence conditions with CO2 flux partitioned into GPP and respiration and uncertainty estimates and a bunch of other goodies that are kind of illustrated more or less in this pipeline. And we call this pipeline a collection of codes, basically because each of these little boxes that you see in this diagram is an individual step that someone developed and was adapted and improved to be used in a production type environment to generate these data sets. And the first data set that we generated using this pipeline is the FluxNet 2015 data set that you can download from the FluxNet website. And I'll mention this in the next slide. But if you want to learn more about OneFlux and the details about each of these processing steps and what kinds of data are generated using this pipeline, we recently published a paper describing this data set with all the information about the inner workings of the pipeline. And another thing I will mention, and this is the second bullet point on the right here, is we have a quick start guide for the flux variables, because this pipeline, when you open the data set, the partition fluxes, for instance, you have quite a few variables that you can use, and they have different purposes. So we elaborated this quick start guide, which is also part of the paper, but we have this handy link here on the website, just guiding you through how to pick the flux variables that you use from this OneFlux generated results. And another thing I'll point to is a webinar that we did a while back, showing how to prepare a site to be processed for with OneFlux, basically. So the idea there is, what are all the requirements? What is everything that has to be in the base product that Trevor just described, and in the Badam product also introduced just now? What information needs to be in there so we can actually process these? And Trevor, if you go to the next slide. So basically, as I mentioned, on the left there, you have the FluxNet 2015 data set. This is getting a little older now. The data is just up to 2014. So that's the last year that was included for insight in that data set. And we had an update in February last year, but that was basically just adding metadata, just adding the soil depth and the heights for some of the measurements, and canopy heights, and a few other pieces of metadata. There is another product that we are working on for AmeriFlux, that is this, and we're calling this the result of processing something with OneFlux. We're calling it a FluxNet data product, just for compatibility globally. So every regional network will generate their own versions, but it will all be using the same pipeline, and it will all be a FluxNet data product. So we have been working on generating a beta product for AmeriFlux with more recent data. And the reason we are calling this beta is just because we are prioritizing speed rather than thorough checks. So these results are largely compatible with FluxNet 2015, and you can check out the results in this link on the right there. And kudos to Xinchen Lu, who has been hard at work to get more sites in there and updated sites in that beta product. And finally, we are also working on a production version of this FluxNet data product for AmeriFlux. This will be available in the main AmeriFlux website. So this download mechanism that Trevor and Margaret just described now, it will include this data product in the future. And we are now collecting the additional metadata that we need to really process these sites thoroughly with all the details correct. And the target is to have the first round of sites published in September 2021. So coming up. And that's what I had. Back to you, Trevor.
Thanks, Gilberto. That's oh yeah, one thing I want to say, we have on the beta products, there's a link in the chat. There are 33 sites there. That number, yeah, specifically chosen to mess with my Irish accents. Where you can download the data, and we sent another approximately 40 to the pipeline yesterday, so they should be published soon. So we'll then have about 70 sites on the FluxNet beta product. So we're rolling that out quickly, and as Gilberto said, the full production version of that will be online sometime this year or early next year as well. So we've gone over the bulk of AmeriFlux data, but what about our collaborating resources? So these sites are making a host of different observations, and there's a lot of information about the sites that is not directly Flux related, not as such, not in the AmeriFlux data archives. Specifically, I'm talking about collaborating networks, such as, for example, phenocams. So phenocams are installed at a large amount of AmeriFlux sites, and you can search for sites that have phenocam measurements using the site search tools that Margaret mentioned. So if you use the advanced filters, you can identify sites that have phenocam measurements, and then go to the phenocam website and pull the information from there. Or LTER sites that are NEON affiliated and have a host of other measurements that NEON are making at those sites as well, for example. So there are a lot of different synergies with different networks, and we're doing our best to link in with those. And you can explore those all through the search options on the website. And the second is collaborating agencies. So particularly here, I want to call out efforts by NASA and USGS to link AmeriFlux sites and this greater facilitate the use of remote sensing data for those sites. So particularly the Motosphere subsetting tool, which allows you to pull out time series of remote sense data for individual sites. Very straightforward process to get that information. And also APIRS, which is extending that kind of approach to a much broader suite of remote sensing observations. So these are great resources if you're looking to better understand the fluxes that are being observed at these flux sites. And also collaborating code bases. So if you go to GitHub, for example, and type in AmeriFlux in the search bar, you will find a real wealth of code that has been developed by individual researchers and published on GitHub to interact with AmeriFlux data. And so this is a massive resource that here, for example, is the AmeriFlux OR code base, which now seems to be a little bit outdated or not being maintained at the minute. But this is an example of something that is a very powerful resource for interacting with AmeriFlux data. So before you go and write all your own code, a quick suggestion to have a look online to see if there's anything published that could be useful for you to use. So at this period of the webinar, we would like to invite individual data users who've recently been either published or we know have been working with AmeriFlux data to give their thoughts and impressions on working with AmeriFlux data and any suggestions they might have for you, the AmeriFlux data users, on what you could have on your radar when interacting with the AmeriFlux data. And before we get into it, I'm really grateful for these three panel members who have granted us some of their time to talk about us and impart their wisdom and their experience. So we're going to have today Mallory Barnes, an assistant professor at Indiana University, Minju Moon, who is a postdoc at Boston University, and Sophie Rohr, who's a grad student at UC Berkeley. So I'd like to start off by inviting Mallory. Mallory, can you hear us? Are you there? Yeah.
I can hear you. I hope
we can hear you. Great.
Good. Okay. So hi, I'm Mallory, and I've done a few different synthesis projects using AmeriFlux sites and data. One project that's currently in review is a machine learning upscaling of eddy covariance data using remotely sensed inputs that's looking at ecohydrological water carbon coupling. And so what we did there was we took a bunch of eddy covariance sites, we derived relationships between the fluxes and the input variables, and then we got those input variables in terms of gridded remote sensing products, and then spatially upscaled those fluxes to the whole globe, actually, at half-degree resolution. And so I'm comparing this product, which is specifically adapted for drylands, to the FluxCom product and the Modus GPP product in that paper. If you could go to the next slide. Trevor mentioned APIRS briefly, but I just wanted to talk a little bit more about it because my work really relies on remotely sensed data. And so AmeriFlux and APIRS already play pretty nicely together, in my opinion. So this is just something I did quickly today. But when you're doing your site search and you find all these sites that you want to look into more deeply, you can copy those search results to your clipboard. And then you can actually just, when you go to APIRS and you want to look at remote sensing data, you can just paste those sites, the site name, the lat and the long, just directly into APIRS, and it'll pull up those sites. And so then you can look at any data you want. You can look at MODIS data, you can look at vegetation indices, you can look at Landsat data. And it's just really nice that you can directly copy your search results into Appears and get that remote sensing data really quickly and easily. There's two options in Appears. There's the area sample and the point sample. So this is a screenshot of the point sample, but if you also had like an area where you had a bunch of flux sites, you could also pretty easily draw a box around it and then pull out all the satellite data from there. So that's kind of my biggest tip lately, is that Appears has been saving me a ton of time and effort. And so I just wanted to talk a bit more about that. But that's my main thoughts.
Super, thank you, Mallory. Minju, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. I thank you for having me. This is Minju Moon. I'm a postdoc at Boston University Land Cover and Surface Climate Group. And first, I would like to thank all the people who are working hard to make this possible, such a great network database. And my basic research area is remote sensing and vegetation phenology and forest ecology. And I use multiple sources of remote sensing data along with many field observations like the AmeriFlux and the PhenoChem network. And a recent experience of the AmeriFlux dataset I have is for the second chapter of my dissertation to assess the impact of the vegetation phenology on the surface energy balance changes during the springtime. I used the MODIS land surface phenology product and then 212 site years of the AmeriFlux data from the 42 sites across the US and Canada. Yes, overall, the data set was really great. I've learned a lot, but here I'll share a little difficulty I had experienced, so hopefully can give a little useful thought through that. So as a user using data from the multiple sites across a larger area, it was not easy to sort out the site I do use for my specific demands as a very first step. For example, to calculate the surface energy balance, I wanted to have all the incoming and outgoing radiations data, at least having the 5-year long. But to check that, I had to download every single CSV files for all the individual sites and then check them all one by one. I know that it's almost nothing to just download and look at the data compared to the data production, but I just hope that it would be great if there was any tool that can make such processes a little easier. Next slide, please. Yes, thanks. It was mentioned just before, AmeriFlux R on our package for the handling AmeriFlux, which provide, I think, only a limited application so far. By comparison, the MODIS tools and the PhenoChem R, other R packages for the MODIS land products and the PhenoChem data to provide the many useful functions from the data download and to a simple analysis. And actually, a fun fact is that all the 3 R packages had developed by only one person, which is who is the Kuhn Hopkins. Yeah. Anyway, but through today's webinar, I've learned that they're having a huge effort to resolve such difficulties. But in addition to that, I think if there is a tool such as the integrated package program or interactive web page for any kind of simple visualization of the data incorporating Badam 2, that would be really nice. Yeah, that's it. Thanks. Trevor, you muted.
Thanks, Minju. Next up, and thank you for your presentation as well. It's great input to have. Next up is Sophie Ruhr. Over to you, Sophie.
Thanks, Trevor. Hi, everyone. My name's Sophie, and I'm a first-year PhD student working with Trevor at UC Berkeley. Right now, I'm interested in relationships between soil moisture, groundwater, and carbon cycling, which dovetails really nicely with this year's theme of water fluxes. So I've just started working with AmeriFlux data in the past few months, so I'm really new to the network, and I'm still working on understanding all that it has to offer. So I'm working on a multi-site synthesis right now, and I'm trying to figure out what sites to use that would work well for the questions I'm asking. So as Margaret also talked about earlier, the site search tool on the website has been really helpful for some initial exploration of what data is available. And I'm specifically interested in finding sites that report water table depth. Trevor, next slide, please. So as Trevor mentioned earlier, there are some variables that don't get reported as often to the AmeriFlux network, and water table depth is one of those. I've found about 30 sites that do report water table depth, but I am running into some problems. So even if the site search tool says that water table depth is recorded at a site, that's not always true. And when I download the data, I will just find a lot of missing values. And then sometimes if a site does have water table depth, the sensor may have only been installed recently. So there are only a few years of water table depth out of many site years. So what I ended up doing is just downloading the entire AmeriFlux data set and writing my own search function specifically for my project, which I think ultimately has been the best way for me to select my sites. Another thing I've been thinking about, some of my colleagues have mentioned that there are probably many sites, for example, neon sites that might record water table depth, but don't actually report it to the AmeriFlux website. So one challenge I've encountered generally is making sure the sites that I'm working with actually have all the data I need, that the data align temporally, and that I'm not excluding any sites because they may not be fully documented on the website. So just kind of echoing what Mallory and Minju just said, tools to align data and understand what's out there are really helpful and maybe could be developed a little bit more. So one other thing I wanted to talk about, Trevor, next slide, please. I'm going to ask you to click through this kind of quickly, is that the website is really, really helpful for first-time users. It seems like all the questions I could ever have could be answered on the website. But just in solidarity with the other first-time users of AmeriFlux data here, is that it can get overwhelming kind of quickly. So Trevor, if you could just click through a few times. If you start clicking on different links to things and opening up tabs and clicking again, Trevor, you can just keep going. I put in just a few different images here to show that it can get overwhelming a bit quickly. And then all of a sudden you maybe have 20 tabs open on your browser window with a lot of information. So I think sometimes it can get confusing about even where to start and understanding how to work with the data. So a webinar like this is so helpful. I feel like I've learned so much just in the past few minutes sitting here. So maybe more webinars like this, or maybe a quick FAQ page, something to get started would be really helpful for first-time users like me. So those are some of my experiences. I'm so excited to be part of this community and really excited about the AmeriFlux data set. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to all the panelists. It's great to have people's direct feedback and especially user experiences at different levels of experience to get a better sense of where we need to be improving the features we are developing to help data users. In that mind, we would like to use the last few minutes of this webinar for an open discussion on what we could be doing to better improve user experiences. To facilitate that, we've set up this poll, which I highlighted earlier, so please do go to that. What would you love to see from AmeriFlux from a data user perspective? That's pollev.com/AmeriFlux. Hopefully easy enough to remember. We have a few suggestions already. So that is in the chat as well. So I'm going to move on if you're looking for it, or hastily scribbling it down, reference your chat box where it is. There's a direct link. So here is the input that people have provided so far. And thank you, first off, for being engaged in this process and for giving us feedback. I can't tell you how useful this is for us in terms of identifying our priorities and setting future goals to better help you. So in the poll, you can either input your thoughts in terms of specific things you would like to see, or you can upvote or downvote those that have been input by others. So it's particularly useful in terms of you get the chance to vote on what other people are suggesting. And here we're seeing in real time what people are thinking. So we've heard from a few of the panelists and also other questions in the chat thinking about how do you explore data when simple tags are often not enough. And this is something where we know from the data, working with the data, even if you know there's a time series of CO2, and it's hard to gauge the quality or the utility for your specific science question without being able to actually see it and look at it and interact with it. So online data visualization tools to view time series of data from a site without downloading would no doubt be helpful in some of those problems that Sophie and Minju in particular raised about how to identify the sites you want to work with that have data that you deem of sufficient or utility for the question you're asking. Connecting with FluxNet is another great suggestion. So for those of you who are not familiar with the FluxNet, how FluxNet works with regional networks process at the time of a FluxNet data release, they process a specific number of sites, as many as they can, and include them in the FluxNet data release. But FluxNet data releases are periodic. So once last one was in 2015, it was updated slightly since then, but the regional networks continuously update the data they provide. So connecting with FluxNet is something that we're actively developing. That's Gilberto spoke about the OneFlux product, which is basically a tool to allow regional networks to produce FluxNet equivalent data products. That's something we're excited about. It is a slow process because there's a lot of information needed to go into such a processing pipeline. And often that information is not directly available. So the third most popular suggestion is a quick idea of percent of observations available for any given variable. So we don't download base for our target variable and find it's all fill values. Yes, this is a really good idea. Something that we could do for that is when you do the filtering, you select the variable. We could also additionally, currently you can select the time period, but that's specific to a variable. So we could think about having a time period filter for a specific variable rather than for the site record, or a percent of observations as suggested here as well. The next one is quick plots again. Yep, I fully agree. I think that'd be a great feature to develop. It does take a lot of web development work to make that possible. Oh, I see we have the same suggestion twice. Well, that's a very upvoted suggestion. In that case, a clear winner is online data visualization tools. I'd also like to take the opportunity at the minute to encourage you all to, if you have specific questions, to put those in chat as well. If there's anything that you feel like we could have covered better, or if you've any questions you came into the webinar with that you continue to have despite our best efforts, then please do feel free to ask in chat, and somebody from the team will do their best to get back to you in the 3 minutes we have before the end of the webinar. So just to highlight Danielle's comment that the advanced filters for site sets does have a filter for specific variables and specific years. So you can select or filter by whether, for example, methane was measured for a specific year at a specific site. What it doesn't have at the minute is the second suggestion is for what percent of data is available during that year. Was it measured for just a month or a week or 6 months or 9 months? Is it 90% gaps, even though it was measured all year? So something of that would be a nice addition. So thank you all for that suggestion. A Python API to programmatically search and download data into memory. That is a really good suggestion, and something we struggle with a little bit in terms of providing those kind of tools is the need to be language agnostic. So people are working in various different languages, and we need to really figure out how we do that in a way that could provide an API that's not specific to a given language. And just to throw it out there, we are more than willing to collaborate and work with anybody out there who is super excited about any of these specific ideas and would like to help. We are chronically resource constrained, super overcommitted budget-wise, as are most projects. We're maxing out everything we want to do. So everything that we're not doing that is really exciting to do is simply because we don't have bandwidth to do it yet. A lot of these are on the timeline for next year or the year after, when we free up time from our other commitments at the minute. But if anybody else would like to step in, we are super excited to collaborate on getting these things done. Thank you, Tingsun. That's a great suggestion. And figuring out how we could get a shared repository for code is something that we would love to do. It is not as easy as you imagine, or at least we have not found an easy way to do that. But we'd be, as I said, excited to collaborate with anybody who has suggestions on how that could be done successfully. Okay, well, this has been very, very useful for us from an AmeriFlux management project perspective. I hope it has been very useful for you from a data user perspective or a data contributor perspective, if that is your perspective. From whatever perspective you've joined us, I hope it's been useful for you. Thank you again for joining. And please do look out for future webinars. This is just one of a series of webinars AmeriFlux is hosting. They're all recorded on our AmeriFlux website, and future webinars that we have planned are also listed there. So without further ado, I will bid you adieu and thank you once again. All right, bye-bye, everyone.
We can leave it open for a minute if people want to put any last minute